We're going to continue our learning with the fundamentals of faith today. And I just wanted to do a quick recap of what we did last week and then just jump straight into it. What we did last week is we focused on where the principles of faith actually come from, where the Rambam codifies them, where he must have actually got them from. We talked about how the Rambam got them as a reflection from the indicators in the Mishnah of people who are off or out of the pale, and the Rambam sort of codifies what you have to do to be in from that. We discussed a little bit last week as to why the Rambam codified it here, why the Torah doesn't seem to emphasize it beforehand as being the system of the Gemara, the Mishnah doesn't seem to focus on these principles. It's only the Rambam. And we talked about the emphasis and the education. How do you want to educate your people? And finally, we spent a little bit of time discussing what happens if you don't believe them. What happens if you decide that for you, the prophets, that isn't something which resonates with you. The fact that God is corporeal, He's got a body, that isn't something, you don't, all these things, you disagree on one or 2 points. So what happens then? So the Rambam says in no uncertain terms, is that, thanks Joe, but you're not part of the team. Right? So the Rambam says that you don't believe in one of these, you're out of the system. And we saw that people disagree. The Sefer HaKarim says that no, that's not. It doesn't have that same gravity. It's not that heavy. But nonetheless, we ended off last week with talking about Rebbe Chanan, he quotes the Rebbe Chaim Soloveitchik, who says that a person who even accidentally doesn't have the right system of belief is going to be, is actually also loses their share in the world to come, which is a huge statement because if you just read the Pew Report. That means to say we can own statistics according to that. Then how many people are essentially not part of the system then, if that's to be true, which is very worrying and disturbing. So we addressed that a little bit last week, but we didn't really give it full time. One other thing to consider is the following: is let's say you have a person who is keeping a Torah system of values, and they're doing mitzvahs, and they're performing all the necessary injunctions of Judaism, but they're doing it because it happens to be, they came to it themselves. It happens to be that most consumers who buy kosher don't buy it for religious reasons. Do you know that? I think 62% of people who buy kosher say they do it for health reasons. Right, so what happens if you happen to be a person who eats kosher not because God told you, but because there happens to be, that there's a more healthy system of checking the factories. There's more likely to be less added ingredients that you don't know about. Right. So what happens if you do that? So do you get is there a value to happen to be approximating the Torah system just because you came to it yourself? You don't work on Sabbath because you take off weekends. Whatever else it is, you live that kind of life. So does that help? Does that work? So David J. Bleich, who wrote a book actually on the 13 principles of faith, we're going to come to them just at the end of today's share. He says that, in the end of the day, that doesn't make the cut. If you're doing it because you're serving either your own system, your health system, whatever else it is, but you're not doing it because you're trying to serve God, then in the end of the day, to a certain degree, you're missing the boat. And that's what the Rambam is saying, is how do you know you're actually doing it for the right reasons if you're serving God? But how do you know what God is? How do you know what His system is? Yeah, I'll tell you how it is. There's 13 ways to know you're doing the right thing. Number 1 is there's a God. Number 2 is that He knows what you're doing. Number 3, so meaning what the Rambam is simply saying is, I'm telling you how to simply know that you're doing what you're doing for the right reasons. That's all the Rambam is saying. If you don't have that, then you're doing whatever you're doing because that's wonderful. You came to it for whatever reasons, but you're not doing it for the right reason. That's perhaps what Rabbi Bleich says in this understanding of the Rambam. Nonetheless, in fact, many of the poskim, and most famously the Chazon Ish, talks about this, where he talks about what is called a category called Tinok Shenishba, which is obviously very famously discussed, and that is that the Gemara talks about a child who was captured by non-Jews and brought up in that society. And in such a society, that the fact that child has certain problems in their belief system or in their practice system is as a function of their bringing up. So it happens to be the Chazon Ish does a very unique thing, and he applies that category to the question that he was asked, in fact, was in Israel. You see, the issue is that as Israel was a fledgling state, what was happening is the people who were in charge of everything, including electricity and water and everything else, all those systems was controlled by Jews. Right? So meaning the people who are operating those factories and operating the waterworks are Jews, but they're not Shomer Shabbos, right? The water carries on flowing on Shabbos in Israel. So how can you switch on the faucet? How can you ever benefit? How can you even just leave the electricity on for Shabbos when you know that the people operating those, the people who are maintaining the factories, they're maintaining the power plants are Jews on Shabbos? That was the question that he was asked already in the 1940s. And therefore he made a very interesting application. And he said, you could say that there's a tinok shenishba, you could say that a person who grew up without knowing better, and already maybe their parents or grandparents already threw off the yoke, really intentionally. And that the Chazon Ish is not addressing. But they themselves, unfortunately, they're at a point in time where they don't necessarily have the control over their education. So this may actually, in fact, supersede what what this Rebbe Elchanan is saying over here in this particular incident, which is just something obviously we resonate with because, a vast majority of Jews today simply don't have the necessary prerequisites to be able to know or not know what is actually going on or what's not true or not true. Be it as it may, this is a very fascinating debate as to what about the accidental person who doesn't believe, the accidental non-believer. Very, very serious and very timely topic, unfortunately. What we have in front of us for today, this is just recap. What we have in front of us today is the following: is the Rambam comes along and revolutionary. He comes along and says these are the 13 tenets of belief. Believe them in, don't believe them out. So the question is did history agree with him? Meaning, was the Rambam wholeheartedly accepted, or were there people who disagreed? Now that's a self-answering question because, in general, Rambam had a lot of books burnt. Meaning forget even the Yud Gimel Ikarim. The Rambam's Moreh Nevuchim was burnt, but also what else of the Rambam was burnt? Yad. The Yad, because his halachic work, in fact, was burnt as well as a function of his first section, Sefer Hamada. Right. So it happens to be that the Rambam in general was never gained full and universal acceptance for many years afterwards. In fact, as we're going to come up to Tisha B'Av in 3 weeks' time, it's interesting to know that one of the kinnos is about the Shali Srufa Ba'esh. I think it's kinna 40, 41. And in that kinna, we talk about how there are 24 cartloads of books, which is a lot of books, especially in the days when you don't have a printing press and everything was handwritten. So in Paris, there was 24 cartloads of books which were burnt. And Rav Meir of Rottenburg, one of the great leaders of the time, wrote a kinna about that. Happens to be that Rabbeinu Yonah is quoted as saying, one of his Talmudim is quoted as saying that the reason why he feels that those books were burnt was because very proximate to that, just beforehand, in fact, the Jews themselves had burnt in the streets of Paris the books of the Rambam. And so he felt that in fact this was a punishment for that incident itself. The book burnings for the book burnings when this occurred based on the Rambam. Now, it wasn't the Yud Gimel Ikarim. The Yud Gimel Ikarim were not burnt, but nonetheless, they also didn't have necessarily the same we'll call it warm welcome all the way through history. So let's examine a few of the people who disagree with the Rambam himself, and then try to come back and say, well, in the end of the day, so bottom line, what do we do? Okay, so let's start at the very beginning. The Rambam, although he doesn't say actually articulate the Yud Gimel Ikarim in his halachic work, he does mention a few of them. This is where he actually paskins. We saw this last week, but let's just revise this for a moment in source 1. This is where the Rambam actually talks about this Mishnah in Sanhedrin. He explains it in the following way. And he says, Chamisha, in source 1, Chamisha haim nikrayin minim. There are 5 people who are called a min. Ha'omer she'ein sham alaka ve'ein lo'olamani. The person says there's no God, nobody's ruling the world, right? The watchmaker left the system and he went to have lunch. But if a person says that, or you say, you know what? There is a leader, but he has a few helpers or partners, right? Maybe 2. A person who says that there is a God, but however he is of form, right? He is of form. He says there is a master, but he is not alone and not the only creator. Or a person who serves any deity or any power in the world. כדי להיות מליץ בינו ובין ריבון העולמים, כל אחד וחמישה אין אלו הוא מין. And a person who has a particular power that he has in conversations with to be between him and God, that is, he is considered a min. We saw that the Raavad, min, it's actually hard to translate exactly. So, because the mean what the Rambam is saying, heretic is the general way we use it, but then it's very similar to the word we use for apikoros, which is also, a heretic. So English doesn't serve us so well here. So actually, the definition of the word is better understood through the Rambam's principle codifying it over here. What you could do, if you wanted to be very careful, is you could take a look at the Rambam's definition of apikoros and his categories there, and min, and then try to get a common denominator between the two of them and get a sense of where the mistakes happen in either. But the word itself doesn't help us so well in terms of heresy, because unfortunately today, and this is why we have to learn this very well, is today the word heretic is thrown around quite freely. It's not so clear. That's why we have to appreciate really who really is a heretic or not. So the Raavad says, the Rav Avram Avbeistin says the following. He says, "Va'omer sheyesham ribon echad ela shu guf ba'al tumuna Amar Avram ve'lama kara lazeh min v'kama gedolim v'tovim mimenu cholchu b'zeh hamachshava lefi ma shiro b'mikros v'yosem ma shiro b'divrei agados hamishavoshes asadeos." So he says that why is the Rambam calling a person who thinks that God has a body? There's a famous story in the beginning of the book Element by Sir Ken Robinson. He has a story about, he's talking about creativity, and he talks about a little girl who's in art class, and she's a 5-year-old, and the teacher notices that every time she comes past her, she covers up her drawing, and so at a certain point, the teacher is very curious and says, "Susie, what are you drawing?" She says, "I'm drawing a picture of God." So the teacher says, "But Susie, everybody knows that you don't know what God looks like." So she says, "Well, in a few minutes they will." So the Raavad says is that if you were to read the Torah and look at the Torah talks about Hashem coming and going and angered and has a hand and an outstretched arm and all these kind of things. You could come to that conclusion, and many people did. So how can you possibly call a person a heretic? How can you call that person out of the pale, says the Raavad. So already we see over here an interesting thing is that maybe the Rambam has exceptions. Maybe the Rambam isn't true across the board. Do you think, just as we're reading this Raavad, do you think this is unique to this particular principle, the fact that God is corporeal, or not? What do you think? Just from what the Raavad says over here. Meaning, is the Raavad attacking, in general, the fact that the Rambam, all the principles of the Rambam says that you've gone too far by disbelieving it, or is he only attacking this specific one over here? What would you think? Why? What was that, Michael? You think this one? Why?
Just from his language, Lama Karela is mean.
Okay, so you're saying why the specific one? But let's further the logic. Why in this case is the Raavad saying that a person is not considered a heretic? Because what led into this conclusion? The Torah itself. Right? Meaning to say, in this particular incident, if you read the Torah, you could come to the wrong conclusion because the Torah simply says it that way. It talks about God in these terms.
So if you read it literally.
He's not disagreeing.
He's not disagreeing with the Rambam.
He's not disagreeing with the Rambam principle.
He's disagreeing with the
versus the min.
Correct.
Because the Torah seems to lead you to that conclusion.
Correct. So now, meaning to say, he's arguing with how are you dubbing this person? Are you dubbing this person a min or not? And what seems to be logical over here is that it's only about this person, not about the rest of them, because there's a reason why you could get to the wrong conclusion, right? The Raavad might say, by other cases, let's say the fact that God exists, right? The Raavad is not going to say, well, you can't call that person a min, right? Because there's nothing to support such a thesis. Dr. Cohen? Okay.
No, just saying, essentially you're saying if you read the Torah, it's a rational conclusion. So you
right.
have somebody who is following your halacha, following your Torah, and he says that other midolom. So how are you able to take?
Correct.
You're disagreeing.
Correct. So, but
a principle that where people who gedolim will disagree with you. So by definition, it's not universally accepted.
Correct. So what that means to say is that the argument is local. That's just the point I want to point out, is that it seems to be a very local argument on this particular number 1 of 13, as opposed to saying this is perhaps the grounds for a full disagreement. So just need to be careful as to how much is being attacked over here. As you notice, by the way, yeah?
The Rambam, I think, would say over here that the interpretation of the Torah is fundamental. So that, for instance, let's say you have something ayin tachat ayin, right? We all understand that that means mamon. So it's the understanding of the Torah. So he would say that you take an anthropomorphism and you take it literally, you're out of the pale also, because you're not interpreting it the way it is accepted to be interpreted.
Interesting. So what you're saying, Elliot, is that actually the only way of understanding it is to be understood through the prism of understanding that there's no such thing as real anthropomorphism or anthropopathism, and therefore, misunderstanding that itself is already the problem.
Yeah, correct.
Right, so that's what the Rambam is saying. Absolutely. But the Rambam's point in countering that is that without that tradition, there were people who made that mistake, who were Chachmei Yisrael. So
misread the Torah. That's improper reading. That's the Christian reading of the Torah.
Okay, absolutely. Okay,
It's a perspective.
in Achinami, but it happens to be that the point the Rav is saying is that history has shown that there have been people who made that mistake, and we can't now retrospectively say, well, they're out. Right? The Rav doesn't identify who they are, but he says Gedolim Tovim Mimenu, right? Meaning to say he feels that they're even, that people the Rambam should not get into the ring with. Right? So you're right. I think that's what the Rambam would say. But the Rav's counter is that history has shown us. Otherwise, you can't now sort of exclude them. We're going to see a number of those type of arguments as we get a little further on, with Mashiach as well. But let's just realize that, of course, we know that the Ravid himself, just take a look at source 2, the Ravid himself does believe that God, in fact, is not of form. This is Rav Isidore Twersky in his biography of the Ravid. He says, there's not a shadow of doubt that the Ravid was personally committed to the traditional Jewish view, which maintained the unlikeness of and incorporeality of God as an indispensable corollary of the existence and unity of God. Those Talmudic legends and homilies which nurture the corporeal misconception of God are, in his opinion, corrupting right opinion and religious matters. Elsewhere in his writings, Ravid is emphatic and unequivocal concerning the elimination of all anthropomorphic attributes with regard to God. It is not correct to speak in this manner about the Creator. So this coming back to Dr. Huberfeld's point, is that the Ravid himself clearly agrees with the Rambam. He just disagrees with the application of min to such a person. Okay, so just to be clear about this. We're going to get to this, I want to get to this Rav Hirsch actually a little later when we come to this actual, maybe we'll spend a little more time focusing on the actual, when we get to this Ikar itself, we'll give a little more time to this Rav Hirsch, which is very, very fascinating. But be it as it may, this is perhaps one of the earlier sources where we see already a disagreement to the Rambam. And the question we have to say is a general local, and it seems to be very localized on this particular issue because of the mistakes that certain people reached.
Doesn't the Rambam himself in Shemona Parokim start saying it's like a children first, as a child, as they grow up, you teach them that there is some kind of a corporeal ability, but as they get more intelligent and they get wider, they use it as a tool for children to grow up and to finally.
No, the Rambam says in Shemona Parokim the Rambam talks about incentive. That's what he says. Meaning, he says we shouldn't be doing Torah for reward, but you can still you can start by educating children to do things for reward. And so you give them chocolates and you give them all kinds of things, and then you build them up, and then you give them money, and then you talk about what's to come and things like that. But at the end of the day, what really is that's about incentivization. He doesn't say that about the Rambam. Never says that about body. Okay, because that for the Rambam is a very dangerous part of the faith system. So this is the starting point. This is where we already see dissent. They joke and they say, how do you know that Hashem created the world? It's because the Rambam said it and the Ravid didn't argue. Right? It's like one of these yeshiva's jokes, because the Ravid argues on everything, right? So if you want to keep the Rambam in check, the first place you go to is the Ravid. But let's go a little further into history. Happens to be that, in fact, that all the way through history, there were people who disagreed. So the first place to look is, in fact, into the Sefer of Or Hashem by Rav Chasdai Kreskas. When I first heard of Chasdai Kreskas, I thought there was a group of people called Chasdai Kreskas. But happens to be Chasdai Kreskas was a rabbi in Barcelona, and he was born in Barcelona in Spain. He later became the Rav of Aragon and Saragossa. And he was a student of Rabbeinu Nissim, the Ran. The Ran is usually found at the back of the Gemaras. On the Rif is the commentary along the side. So he is one of the later medieval commentators living in the 14th century. And happens to be he was a major philosopher. In fact, they say, if I'm not mistaken, they say that I'm trying to remember. They say that Spinoza, in fact, originally was inspired by the teachings of Rav Kreskas. He obviously went off the pale. He himself, in terms of but he was a formidable philosopher, and he has a book called Or Hashem, the Light of God, and in it he says the following: Hamaymer Hasheni. He says the following, and this is regarding principles of faith. But he comes to a different conclusion to that of the Rambam. He says the following: I want to talk to you about the foundations upon which the house of God is built upon. And if you're able to understand the foundations, you can understand the building which is resting upon them. If you're to remove one of the foundation stones, then the entire building would collapse. Okay, so he feels that these are them. This is really where it starts. What are them? Because when I looked at the Torah, I found that there were 6 foundation stones, as opposed to the 13 of the Rambam. Rav Chasdai Kreskas says there's 6. What are they? Ha'echad yedias Hashem, knowing God, b'nimtzos, that among existence. Habeis hashkachasai, his vahem, Hashem, knowledge of the world. Gimel yecholto, his ability. Hadalad nevuah, the 4th is the fact that he has prophecy, he communicates with humankind. Hey is the 5th one is bechira, free will, and finally is vav is atachlis, is the point of existence, or the ultimately reward and punishment of the within this creation. So he has 6 principles. Now, if you want to it's very hard to read the words here, but he comes to them and he shows you philosophically how he reaches them. This is very fascinating. He says, "V'zeh l'masha hayasa Torah po'al ritzoyni me'amitzvah." This is what the Torah wants when it gives humankind a commandment. Asher hu ha'po'al el ha'mitzvah, asher hu ha'mispo'el. That God is the one who is the actor who commands the mitzvah, and we are the mispa'el, we're the person who commanded. It means to say, if there's such a relationship, right? We know, when we open the Torah tells us, keep Shabbos. That means to say that we are recipients of a command. So that relationship itself demands the following. It demands that the person commanding knows, right? He knows and wants and is able, right? Because if he commanded and he wasn't serious about it and he walked away, then why would he be commanding? It must be he knows what you're doing, he's able to give repercussions on what you're doing, and he's willing, right? If such a relationship exists, and from the same communication, you're also able to know. And that means to say that if such a command exists, it must mean that the recipient is willing and can choose and not being forced. Right? Then he goes on, and of course, because there is a relationship, there must be a continued relationship, which is through prophecy. So what he essentially does is, I don't know what that particular base is over here. Hashleimos tachlis yadua ein hemlet b'poal hasholem hazeh v'liyos letachlis choshuv v'lozeh de'einoi lechalek mehamayimar l'shisha klalim. And it must be, therefore, he says, that therefore there's a purpose of this whole relationship. Meaning, if I'm looking at this relationship and God's saying you should be doing something, I know that God exists, God knows, and God is able. I know that you can think, you can choose. And there must be a relationship of communication between the two of you, and there's an outcome that if you do it, you're going to get a great reward. If you don't do it, you're going to get punished. So he says, just from that communication, I can derive 6 principles, and without them, the whole communication falls apart. But with them, it all makes sense. That's what he says. So you see what he's doing? He's starting from a very different point to the Rambam, right? He's not coming to the Mishnah in Sanhedrin and talking about people believing God or not. He's just saying, I'm looking at the basis of religion. Does it have to be Judaism? Not necessarily even. This is philosophically the fundamentals of any religion, says Rav Kreskas. So coming to it himself, he arrives at a very different perspective. It happens to be the Rambam approximates most of these, right? The Rambam talks about all these things, with the exception of, what does the Rambam exclude from these? Bechira, right? The Rambam doesn't include free will. Interestingly, why it doesn't. But it might be that he includes that in Schar V'Onesh. Not clear. But at the end of the day, it's interesting that the Rav Kreskas comes to a different conclusion. Let's go a little further. Rav Shimon Duran, who was in fact the Tashbates or the Rashbates, also born in Barcelona, and in around the same time, in fact, as Rav Kreskas, he actually moved to Africa, became the Rav of Algiers, and also formidable in philosophy, astronomy, and mathematics. So he has a pirush on Maseches Avos called Magen Avos. Very early pirush on Maseches Avos, and of course we all begin Maseches Avos with the Mishnah in Sanhedrin, which is Kol Yisrael Yesh Lahem Chelek L'Olam Haba. Shnei Avamei Kulan Tzadikim L'Olam Right? That's the way we start Pirkei Avos. So in his pirush on Avos, he starts commenting on that, and what he does is he says something very interesting. He starts talking about how, and this is a section of it of his introduction, but what he starts saying is the following: is that there's three categories of principles. And the first five of the Rambam can be slotted into my principle number 1, belief in God. The next 3 can be slotted into the notion of Torah min hashamayim. And the last 2 can be slotted into my last one, which is relationship. So what he starts doing is he starts looking at the Rambam, and he says the Rambam isn't maybe necessarily 13. Maybe the Rambam is essentially 3, just compressed into categories. Now that's very interesting. Right, so is he disagreeing with the Rambam? Not clear. It's not clear if he's disagreeing with the Rambam. He has a few questions on the Rambam, but it seems more like what he's doing to the Rambam is he's streamlining what the Rambam had done. Right, the Rambam is a system, but I'll give you. We'll call it the structure of the system. Says the Tashbates. Now, the person who was the greatest student of both of the Rav Kreskas and the Tashbates, who lived just a little after them, and his name was Rav Yosef Albo. Lived in 1380 to 1444, and also living in Christian Spain. And he wrote a book. He was actually very involved in the disputation at Tortosa, and he wrote a book called Sefer HaIkarim, the book of the Ikarim. We're more familiar with Rav Yosef Albo and Sefer HaIkarim. It's more well known. It happens to be that he's built on the lap of both Rav Kreskas and the Rashbates, who are lesser known. He was a student of both of them. And he says the following: he disagrees with the Rambam. We saw before he disagrees with the gravity of the 13 principles, but he also disagrees within the number. And this is what he says in the very top of page 4. He says, "Aderech hanachon sheyir'eh li b'sfiras ha'ikarim heim ha'sharashim v'yasodas ha'torah like Yesu." This is the best way to count them, he says. The truth is, ki ha'ikarim ha'kolalim v'ha'echrechim l'das ha'lakis heim shloisha. There are only 3. Ve'metzius Hashem, the existence of God, hashkachas l'shchar v'ones, that Hashem is aware for schar and onesh, and Torah min hashamayim, and the fact that the Torah is from heaven. And these 3 are the primary, the primary 3 categories for anything else in religion. When you say Torah, it means to say it incorporates everything about that subject. Im efshar sheimtza yoser me'achas bizman echad oy bezu achar zu. V'tachas kol ikar me'elu asheroshim seifim hamishtargim v'hamistafim min ha'ikarahi. And of course, every ikar is going to have now bullet points. There's going to be subcategories of each of these. Kitachas mitzios Hashem hu shoresh yoser kadmon v'nitzchi v'domehem. The fact that we believe in God means to say that we believe that He was the creator of the world. The fact that He is eternal, that He was, will be. Right? That He's alone, that there's nobody else, that we should pray to Him. Right? All these things, which the Rambam will set up as separate categories, are in fact 1. Ubichlal Torah ben Shamayim hi yedias Hashem v'nevuah v'domeyim. When we say that we believe in Torah, that means to say we believe in the prophets. We believe that Moshe's prophecy is unique. We believe that nothing's changed. Right? All those things the Rambam will say will be separate, unique things. He says no, that's all incorporated into Torah ben Shamayim. What does he leave out, by the way? What couldn't fit into these categories? Interestingly enough. What of the Rambam's 13 will not make the cut into the Sefer HaKarim's general 3? Right, so Mashiach might be one of them, and what else? Okay, interesting. Well, that might be part of that. I'm trying to remember if he actually attacks that point himself. But another part of it is Mashiach and also Tchias HaMesim. Right, those two don't really sound like they're part of the system that he has, and he says it. What was that? It might be part of Schar V'Onish, but I think he actually says himself that it doesn't have the same severity. What he does say at the end, though, is a very interesting thing. He says in the last paragraph, he says, "Va'amora al heyos gimal ikarim alalu shorish v'yesod le'emunah." So he says, I need to find something that I can pin this to, because in the end of the day, the Rambam, what's the Rambam doing? The Rambam is reflecting on the Mishnah and Sanhedrin, and he's telling you that the reflection of that Mishnah and Sanhedrin, the people who are out, is my system. So where's he coming from? Sounds like he's just sitting down and thinking about things and thinking more about things, and he's coming up with a system. So where does he get it from? So he says the following. Listen to this. He's Yisod le'emunah asher bo yagia ha'adam el hatzlacha sa'amitis hu mash yistor lanu anshe knesset gdola b'tfilas musaf shel Rosh Hashanah gimel brachos. He says when you read the tefillah of Musaf on Rosh Hashanah, that there are 3 separate brachos. What are they? Shem malchios zechronos shofros shem keneged gimel ha'ikar malalu. Right, laha'ir leva adam ki ba'emonos ha'ikar malalu he'em siyifeim v'shorasheim k'fi ma shero yizke adam b'dino lifnei Hashem. That if a person believes on the highest holy day of the year, these 3 principles, malchios zechronos shofros, which he feels are parallel to. Here's the idea of the fact that there is God, the fact that there's hashkacha, the fact that there is Torah min Hashemayim. Though that is what he feels, therefore, is the basis of what Anshe Knesset Gdola was doing on Rosh Hashanah. Notice, by the way, that Rosh Hashanah is the only davening in the year that has 3 in the middle. Generally, Shemona Esrei is in the format of 3 at the beginning, 3 at the end, and a subsection in the middle. On a weekday, we have 13 in the middle. On Shabbos and Yom Tov, we have 1 in the middle. That's it, right? So there's 7 in total on a regular Shabbos, a regular Yom Tov, and there's 19 on a regular day. Why Shemona Esrei? Which one was the extra one? Not clear. Not so clear. There's a debate as to what was the extra, what was expanded. But on Rosh Hashanah is the only time in the year where we actually have 3 in the middle. So Rav Albo says that the 3 in the middle are obviously very fundamental. How fundamental are they? They're the fundamentals of faith. That's what Rav Albo says. And by the way, this is just a snippet of a much longer book. He has the Sefer HaKarim is an entire book. He spends a lot of time on this. And you'll notice, by the way, that this is in this section quoted is. Let's just see where this is. This is in section 4, Sefer HaKarim 1:4. Right. This is in Maimer Aleph, section Dalet. The previous 3 sections were attacking the Rambam. He spent a long time actually, piece after piece, arguing on the Rambam for different reasons. Okay. And at this point in time, he says, well, this is what I believe. This is not what I just disbelieve. This is what I do believe. So this is the Sefer HaKarim most famously disagrees with the Rambam. At a certain point, he actually argues that the Rambam really meant what he said. Meaning to say the Rambam really was getting at what he really meant, but he's making it much simpler for us to have it into the categories of 3. But he does disagree with the gravity of disbelieving. That he does say explicitly, as we saw last week. Now, this is, if you're looking at these particular arguments, what are these arguments doing to the Rambam? What's going on over here? Just to look at the system of what's happening. The Rambam says you have all these very important principles. If you step over the line, you're out, right? And what are all these people doing? What's the Tashbates? What's the Or Hashem? What's the Sefer HaKarim doing? They're minimizing what the Rambam is saying. Essentially, they're saying to the Rambam either you need less, like the Tashbates, or perhaps we can broaden the categories into bigger things, and therefore there's only 3 of them. But at the end of the day, what they're doing is they're saying you don't need as much as the Rambam said to be part of this, to be a part of the party.
They're slotting them into their 3. His 13, or most of them, are ending up.
Okay, right.
3. So he's not arguing. The bottom line is the same. You're over this. Doesn't matter if you're over number 9 of the Rambam or number 1.
Yes or no. He at the same time the Rambam didn't give us 3, right? Meaning at the end of the day, the Rambam still felt that each of these is distinct and unique. But in the end of the day, also there are certain ones who are not going to fit into his rubric. So in the end of the day, what's happening is they're minimizing. What I want to do learn with you at this point in time now is the people who disagreed with the Rambam in the opposite direction. Right now, everybody's disagreeing with the Rambam up to this point in history and saying, the Rambam, you got too many, it's too much, so let's minimize it, or let's categorize it. But in the end of the day, they're simplifying the Rambam system. Now let's see the argument in the opposite direction. So it happens to be that the Abarbanel, besides for being the most prolific author on the Torah, he wrote many other Svarim as well. He was unbelievable. He wrote a sefer called Rosh Amanah. The Rosh Amanah is a 24-chapter book dedicated completely and utterly to the Rambam, to the Rambam's 13 Principles of Faith. It is really quite remarkable. And what he does is the following. It's quite something to see. So the Rav Dan Yitzchak Abarbanel, as we know, living a little later, he's living later than all of these people we've talked about up till now, says the following. And what I did is I put the table of contents of the Rosh Hashanah so you get a sense of what the book's about. Okay, so he starts off, this is on the right-hand column on source 7, HaPerek HaRishon. This is just, and the Abarbanel in his clear, lucid way of describing things, that everything you know what's coming. So here's his introduction. Here's HaPerek HaRishon, Bezichron das harav hamaimoni b'yisod ha'torah v'korea k'fi ma shehevi b'hirish ha'mishnah v'sefer minyan ha'mitzvahs asher lo. So number 1, he says, I'm going to lay out in chapter 1, what are the 13 principles of faith. Chapter 2, Perek HaSheni, b'deyos shar ha'chachamim sheba'u achro b'inyan ha'ikorim ha'mitzvahs asher bohem right k'fi ma shezochar harav chastai b'sefer or Hashem asher lo v'arav Yosef Alba b'sefer ha'ikorim. Now I'm going to give you the people who disagree. Chapter 2 is the people who disagree. What we've done up till now. HaPerek HaShlishi b'zichron sheva shvaisrei seikos she'ira chachamim mahem b'divrayim al ha'ikorim asher hevi harav ha'maimoni. I'm going to now enumerate the 17 questions that they have on the Rambam. Then he continues. And the next parak is Esrim v'shloisha seikos, another 23 questions. Asher he'ir harav chastai neged harav ha'maimoni ba'avur ha'mitzvahs Hashem mona b'ktsas ha'ikorim. And now I have another 23 questions which Rav Chastai actually asks on the Rambam. And then HaPerek HaChamishi b'shmones seikos acherem she'arti ani. I have another 8 questions which I felt that they didn't actually address. Okay, so let me be absolutely clear, says Abarbanel. Any problem you have, I'm going to put it out over here. We're going to do the laundry publicly. We're going to make sure every dot is known. This is what the Abarbanel seeks to do. By the way, I didn't include this in the source sheets. I found this afterwards, but I was able to get hold of a very lucid table in English of all these questions. So, just as an example. These are the 27 questions listed in the Abarbanel. Just as an example, the 5th of the Maimonides principles that God ought to be worshipped is a particular commandment, and as such ought not to be counted as a principle. Meaning, the fact that you pray to Hashem is a mitzvah, not an ikar. That's one of the questions that's asked. Meaning, right, tefillah is a command. Another example: why would denying belief in resurrection cause the Torah to collapse? Which is essentially what Rav Albo is doing. Right there, he's excluding Tchias HaMesim. Why did Maimonides fail to count as a principal belief creation? Right, so there's things he should have, there's things he shouldn't have. There's many, many examples of this. Why in the Sefer Hamada did Maimonides call the first principle the foundations of all foundations, Yesod HaYesodos, right, and the pillar of all sciences, instead of calling it one of the foundations? Right, there are many, many questions the Rambam has on him. That's one of Abarbanel's questions. But in the end of the day, I'll try to send this out to Bnei Neder after Shir. If anybody's not on the mailing list, the email list, please let me know so I can include you. But the Abarbanel lays out very clearly all disagreements on the Rambam. And then, that's only up till chapter 5. And now he says, in Perek Sheshi, in the 6th chapter onwards, בהקדמה הראשונה הנצטרך עליה לביאור הדרוש הזה להתורת הספקו והיא מאורע שם עיקר ושם יסוד. He says, first I want to define for you what an ikar means. Then he goes on to say, Biur Akdama Shnia, I'm going to give you a second introduction in 7th chapter. I'm going to explain the first one. And he goes on, he spends 22 chapters explaining and defending the Rambam. Right? He is the knight in shining armor. He defends the Rambam against all these questions, his own, Rav Yosef Albo's, Rav Kreskas's, all of them, he defends the Rambam. And at this point in time, you're at 22 chapters in. You think, okay, you've made the case. This is it. There's nothing else to be said. He's going to give the stamp of history. He's going to have the last word on the matter. And then he does an about turn. 180 degrees. Chapter 23, what happens is after fully defending the Rambam, the Abarbanel actually now attacks the Rambam. which is the most remarkable thing. In the last 2 chapters of Rosh Hashanah, the Abarbanel disagrees with the Rambam. Listen to his disagreement. I included this section actually in our notes. This is on the top of page 5. He says, "V'chein kosav harav hagadol." I like to tell you, read the Rambam's principles himself. B'perush HaMishnah, b'zichron ha'ikarim b'ikar hashmini. What is the 8th principle of faith according to the Rambam? He says, "Shehu Torah min hashamayim." The Rambam believes that Torah is from heaven. Right? You have to believe that. He says, "Amr Zal, ve'ein hefresh bein b'nei cham kushu mitzrayim bein anochi Hashem Elokecha." And the Rambam makes explicit that it doesn't make a difference whether you disagree with the pasuk that the b'nei Kush are Mitzrayim, which is a pasuk in Parshas Noach, right? And meaning about the generations of a part of the family which is not really significant to Jewish history, or you just believe in the first of the Aseret HaDibros. It doesn't make a difference. Right? Hakol mipi agvura, v'hakol Torah Hashem tamima, kedusha ve'emes. It's like an electric circuit. You could pull out the smallest diode, but at the end of the day, if the circuit isn't complete, it's not working. So the Rambam says that any letter, even seemingly insignificant pasuk in the Torah, breaks the system. It's a circuit breaker. V'hinei, hoida b'fiv u'b'sfasav shebe'inyan ha'emunos u'b'bechinos ha'emes. The Rambam himself agrees that ein roi shenaniach b'toras ha'elokim emunos b'madregos ha'shoroshim v'hascholos sheyichuyav kol bal das lekablom v'emunos acheros sheyuchal l'sapek bohem. That means to say, the Rambam is saying, you can't put any part of the Torah on a pedestal above any other part of the Torah. The Rambam just told us that pasuk in Noach, talking about the generations of Cham, is equally as significant to us as the first of the Aseret HaDibros. So you can't tell me, therefore, that there's actually tiered systems within the Torah of things you should believe more and things you should believe less. It doesn't work like that. He says, "Ki kulam yechuyav shekabel v'yamin ha'yosam emes eloki v'lo yisapek v'lo ya'arer al shum davar me'hem." Because you know what the problem is when you say to us, these, let's give a random number. These six are the ultimate. These 6 are the most important. What are you saying? You're saying is the other 607, right? That are really essentially, it's all right. You could really give them second thoughts. That's what you're saying. So the Abarbanel said, but the Rambam himself laid out that you can't ever create such a doubt. Look at that pasuk in Parshas Noach. If it's true about the belief, same too in mitzvahs. You can't tell me that certain mitzvahs are more important than other ones. You see very important mitzvahs. Example, Zichron Yom HaMa'amad HaNivchar, right? Remembering the day of Ma'amad Har Sinai, right? Zichron Yetzias Mitzrayim. We talk about Yetzias Mitzrayim all the time, right? That's a very important mitzvah. V'asiyas hayoshav atov, and this is a very important mitzvah, is doing the right and the good, which is an inclusive mitzvah. After Recha Kamoicha, loving your friend as your neighbor, which has got many, many applications. But they aren't included in the Ikarim. How can you choose one mitzvah over another, which is more important? We know the Mishnah of us says, don't start playing games and don't start saying, I'm going to hedge, I'm going to do a lot of this in order to be able to get a good, this is a good stock to take. Because you don't know, you just simply don't know what's going up and down in the spiritual world. How can you choose tell me therefore what are the roots and what are the branches of the tree? So he says, if this is true, then what's he done? He's essentially thrown the Rambam out the window, right? Because the Rambam has now given us 13 principles. So essentially he's saying, well, you can't have 13 principles because that means to say there are another 600 which are not really on the same level. So what's the Rambam doing then? He spent his whole time defending the Rambam.
He says Torah min Shemaim. Once he says Torah min Shemaim, so he says they're all legal. He doesn't have to.
Right, but then the Rambam shouldn't have 13 principles. So all the Rambam should have said is Torah min Shemaim, and everything else should be justified.
Well, he's trying to simplify it for one person. That can't
Okay, good.
Okay, good.
He needs, right. We need to understand what the Rambam is trying to do. But we need to appreciate stage 1. The Rambam's argument, stage 1 is that everything is an Ikar Emunah. Every single part of Torah is an Ikar Emunah to believe in, because you can't really doubt anything else which is on a tier 2. Therefore, what's the Rambam doing? So as you're addressing Dr. Herdingman, and this is what he says, he now tries to defend the Rambam. I'm going to tell you what I think he's trying to do. Shaloi kiva nasas ikarim v'yisodis b'mitzvahs haTorah. The Rambam was not saying telling us what are the principles of the Torah. Ki hu lo mana bichlalam shum mitzvah ma'asis k'mosh zacharti. You'll notice that none of the principles of the Torah are actually mitzvahs. So he's not actually putting on a pedestal one mitzvah above the other.
I mean, if the Rambam said, the Rambam incorporates Bechira, so if they all can't be Ikarim, every single mitzvah, or otherwise everything would have to be, you have to take it on faith,
right.
Every single one of them. So Rambam, that's why he has 13, and he has Bechira, that means you can obviously do everything else beyond it.
So they're prerequisites essentially for the rest of them. So let's come back to that in just a moment. I want to see how if we can put this into the words of Abarbanel himself. That Abarbanel is trying to address this issue. Is at the end of the day. So how are you putting something on a pedestal? So his answer number one is that in fact the principles of faith are not mitzvahs. So you're not putting one mitzvah above the other. This is a gam inyan emunos lo asa asam ikarim lahagid she'emunos ha'elu muzilosam heimei ikarim nischayev lahaminam. It's not saying that these you have to believe. Aval shehais lakavanosa lehayashir lahanashim asher lo yehemiku b'Torah. He says, look, there's many people we know. You meet many Jews, and there are many very simple people out there. Right? There are many people who don't have, they're not going to be philosophers, and they're not going to be professors at universities. They're regular amcha, regular holy Jews. Right? He says, and they didn't have necessarily the same educational opportunities. Bachar Rava Mikol Emunos, Oisam Yugimol Emunos, Hayoser Kololos, Kede Lelamed Oisam Derek Tzora. He says, but therefore the Rambam says, I'm going to set up a system for those people who can't necessarily come to principles themselves through learning everything. I'm going to give you the basics of Judaism. Does this mean to say that there's some things more important than others? No, it means to say that these are more encompassing. Perhaps that was what you're saying, Baruch, that they're more. These are the introduction to Judaism. That every person can have access to Torah or completion. Even people who are not educated by receiving the emunus. So therefore, when the Rambam says the 13 principles, listen to this last line. They are really 13 according to the Talmid HaShomea as an educational tool, not as really an objective reality. So when the Rambam says that there are 13 principles, he's not saying that these 13 principles are the absolute. He's telling you, I want to educate people, and therefore if you need to educate, you need these prerequisites to really believe the rest of the system. So it's almost like you can sort of hear the balloon fizzling now, right? The Abarbanel's put a pin in it. What the Abarbanel's saying is that the Yudgil Makarim of the Rambam isn't as significant as we perhaps thought about it, because everything is significant, but this is perhaps the easiest way to access the easiest prerequisites to the whole system itself. I see that we've got a little bit over time. What we didn't get to today, and we're going to spend maybe a little bit of time next week on, is in fact the modern day resuscitation of this argument, and that is actually in the last 25 years there's been a very heated debate over the principles of the Rambam. In article after article, there's been rejoinders after rejoinders after rejoinders, and it's got very, very heated. And what we're going to do is we're going to spend a little bit of time just tracing that argument that has appeared recently. And with that, we'll be able to actually now dive straight in to the Ikarim themselves. Because a lot of the arguments which are made, we're going to see are actually very specific. So what we've been doing now is very general. We have time now to actually go into the specifics and see how they apply to each of the specific Ikarim. Thank you very much for making it on the hardest day to have this. We're not going to be doing this on Tisha B'Av.